In this world, we are surrounded by stories that can be very deceiving. We are talking about stories that turn more and more complex the longer you think about them. You might think you're getting the story of a particular incident that happened to a unique man at one specific point in his life. But every twist and turn of the story will just uncover unexpected trails, background details, and significant consequences. The beginning of this story will be difficult to pinpoint, and the ending will be impossible to catch. This story extends, shifts, and surprises at every turn. It starts as a story of one man's close encounter with death, and it evolves into something greater, something darker, at times sinister, and much bigger than anyone could have expected, including the protagonist of the story, a man called Matthew Keane. This is his story. Before we dive into this story, if you are here for the first time and are interested in hearing more tales of high strangeness delivered in dulcet tones such as mine, go ahead and subscribe to this channel for more content. Matthew Keane is from Southwest Virginia, and his life has never been exactly easy or normal. Throughout his life, Matthew has had to face challenges more difficult and strange than most people could imagine. There have been specks of the supernatural, the incomprehensible, and the impossible throughout his entire existence. However, there was one event in his life that marked a definite before and after. These are the things that led up to it. At first, Matthew's life wasn't exactly extraordinary. The suspicions that there were things greater than us than this world out there were always present, and something somber was always hiding under the surface. But Matthew went on, like most of us, thinking that perhaps the darkness couldn't reach him. He wasn't alone. He recalled even the impossible yet undeniable incident when his own father glanced up at the sky and became witness of UFO activity. The knowledge of that large, brilliant orb that passed by the sky above their heads and got lost in the universe, always under the threat of a possible comeback, set the tone for a lifetime of experiences that shouldn't have been real. And not only were they impossible to avoid, but they were also extremely dangerous. Growing up and growing old, Matthew had to face a series of increasingly difficult-to-overcome obstacles. He had to find the hard way that simply being alive was harder than anybody ever warned us. The unfortunate consequence was a history of depression and substance abuse. These terrible circumstances affect and attack too many of us. Some people fight back and get over their addictions. Some poor souls succumb to the weight of it all. Very few in the world, if any, have had to deal with it the way that Matthew Keane was forced to do. Matthew's depression and abuse of alcohol and other substances were detrimental to his life and spirit, and made all the challenges even worse than before. As is often the case, these issues led Matthew directly into a dark tunnel that he nearly didn't make it out of alive. The temptation to end everything, put an end to his own life in order to escape the pain and the self-inflicted terrors chasing him was too powerful. One time, he got too close to taking the final step, losing the battle and attempting to kill himself. That wasn't the end, though. Not for Matthew. Not yet. But the feeling of extreme loneliness, that inhumane cold that stuck to his bones in those critical moments when he struggled for his life, he would never forget it. And, unbeknownst to him, he would have to face that terrifying middle ground between life and death once again. This time, it would be against his will. As Matthew already knew, having a life in this world, in these times, wasn't easy. Among plenty of challenges that presented themselves to him every day, there was the issue of finding a job, especially in the rural area he was used to. It was something often dreaded, but necessary in order to survive this world we created. Matthew tried several different jobs throughout his life, many times as an electrician. But one of those jobs stood out among the rest. It was his job as part of a tree removal service. In fact, that would be the job that changed his life. As part of the tree removal company, Matthew worked hard and responsibly. It wasn't an easy job, but he was content enough, at least until they faced the one job that would change everything. Matthew, along with his colleagues, the truck, the escalator, and the necessary tools, got to their destination. They had to work on some trees at the top of a hill, and it was a tricky job due to the several houses located at the bottom of it. One wrong move, and a heavy branch, or even worse, a full tree would end up crushing the roof of one of those houses. This meant the team had to be even more careful than usual, work harder, and even try techniques that not all of them were used to. It started out well. Matthew was just doing his job as usual, but the work complicated quickly. In order to take down the tree and its heavy branches, the team had to use a complex system that involved something akin to a pulley system and the support of other trees. Matthew did his best and followed the instructions, but he couldn't help but feel an ounce of doubt at this new system he was unfamiliar with. He didn't suspect that his fear was well placed, because, in the blink of an eye, in one fateful second, something went wrong. The system failed. One of the ropes snapped, and one of the branches fell from the tree and swung on a large arc, directly toward Matthew. He only stood there unsuspecting. He didn't stand a chance. He wouldn't have had a moment to react, to jump away, to avoid his cruel fate in any way. The tree branch came down at a truly extraordinary speed and hit Matthew directly in his face. Matthew's body was raised above the ground and thrown several feet back. He landed on his back, out of breath, barely conscious, and with absolutely no idea of what he was about to deal with. It was a wonder that he was still awake, and yet that was a relative thing. Matthew was aware of his surroundings, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get his body to move. He told himself that he just needed to sit up, move to a seated position, find his glasses, and then he would be all right. He didn't suspect the depth of the damage he had just suffered. There, lying on the ground, experiencing unspeakable pain, Matthew finally saw his colleagues approach him. When he saw those tough men's faces of utter terror, it finally registered in his mind the severity of his situation. It was all rushing on him at once. The damage was incalculable, and yet Matthew continued to lie there, barely awake, in a pool of his own blood, trying to sit up. Matthew's colleagues finally were able to react, call an ambulance, and wait for a miracle, while honestly expecting the worst. It would be a miracle if their friend even made it to the hospital alive. Against all odds, despite the tremendous blood loss and the horrifying harm to his skull, Matthew Keane made it to the hospital, but that was still the beginning of the fight. The doctors were trying to pull off a miracle with their bare hands. It was estimated that Matthew had lost about half of all the blood in his body. But as soon as the doctors started to be hopeful about Matthew's recovery, he was delivered terrifying news. The doctors had called Matthew's girlfriend, who was calm and strong throughout this outstandingly difficult time. She was with him when the doctors let him know that to repair the damage caused, they would have to put him under and induce him into a state of coma that wouldn't last a couple of hours, but probably a few days. It ignited a primal fear in Matthew's heart. He instantly remembered the time he had been so close to death during his time at rock bottom with depression and addiction. But he didn't have a choice. There was one problem, though. Matthew was put to sleep, and the doctor got to work on his body. But, in the meantime, what would happen to Matthew's soul? It started quite simply. He fell asleep slowly, and he woke up calmly in endless darkness. It could have been just a dream, and he didn't immediately lose his composure. But that was when the real feeling started. It happened all at once. All his nerves were set on fire, and every inch of his body fell victim to the most excruciating pain imaginable. His 5 senses were overwhelmed by unmeasurable pain. The sounds. He would never forget those sounds for as long as he lived. He actually remembered witnessing a shooting a few years prior, thinking that heartless chaos could be the worst sound on Earth. But he wasn't exactly on Earth anymore, was he? Matthew Keene was in hell, and he was listening to all of humanity being tortured at the same time. It was a sound impossible to put into words, something that Hollywood would never come close to replicating. Those billions of screams of infinite agony came from all around him. And then Matthew became aware of a presence behind him. It wasn't another lost soul like him. It was something evil, malicious, and powerful. It was coming closer and closer. Matthew could feel its heinous power radiating like a corrupted sun on his back. He could feel the beast's putrid breath enveloping his body. With one last shred of conscience and desperate hope, Matthew realized it was time to beg. He fell to his knees and begged more desperately than he thought was possible. He broke his heart open to beg for a compassionate power above for a second chance. He begged for forgiveness and prayed for a second chance at life. An opportunity that he could be better. Better than he was. Better for him. For God. Despite how fervently he prayed, he was actually surprised when a blinding light appeared in front of him. It was a ray of light coming from above, and Matthew Keene knew at once that he had been saved. Something or someone too beautiful for a mere human to comprehend came down from that spotlight and offered Matthew a hand. He didn't hesitate to take that hand, but at the exact same time, he felt a large, heavy, sharp claw grab his ankle and try to pull him back down into those hellish shadows of torture. The back and forth, the push and pull, the fight between hell and hope could have lasted an eternity. But Matthew woke up. He woke up again. Human, alive, on Earth. And in the middle of surgery. It was much earlier than he was supposed to wake up from his coma. But he wasn't complaining. He was utterly and blissfully happy to be alive. This monumental joy was more than enough to sustain him through the many surgeries and the extremely arduous recovery process. But, all things considered, he made it. He had his second chance. He had accepted God. He had found his faith, his purpose. And although he couldn't completely shake off the darkness that continued to chase him at every turn, everything was insignificant in comparison to his happiness to get this second chance. He thought that would be the end of the story. One close encounter with hell and one victorious return to life. He didn't suspect there was a lot more waiting for him. Before I finish this story, I just want to say thank you for choosing to watch this video, and I hope you're enjoying my storytelling. If you are, please hit that like button, and if you don't already, subscribe to my channel. Also, those of you that have been kind enough to support me on my new Patreon account were able to get early access to the uncut audio of this story, ad-free prior to my YouTube upload. I have a starting tier of just $3 per month, and have just launched a new $9 per month tier, where you can get access to the interview I conducted with Matthew Keene telling his story, plus other exclusive content I'll be adding. If you want to support my mission to become a full-time storyteller and content creator, please head over to Patreon and consider signing up. Since that accident, the unusual and foreboding things that had always been present in Matthew's life to some degree suddenly reached an all-time high. Everywhere he turned, there was something dark and menacing waiting for him. It started right at home, with some odd knocks on the walls at night that he tried his best to ignore. But when the oddities followed him beyond those four walls, he started to fear the worst. The ominous signs followed him out of hell, out of hospital, and out of his home. Matthew was painfully aware of something following him everywhere he went. Some pressure lurking in the shadows around him, getting closer and closer. Every time he walked out of the house, he heard the bushes rustling nearby, and never caught any animal or reasonable explanation for it. When he walked down the street, he'd heard some echo of his footsteps, convinced something was trailing after him. Even while visiting friends, there would be strange sounds where there used to be peace, owls in unusual places, previously peaceful dogs growling at nothing in particular, and even hiking trails vanishing right behind him when he strayed too far away from home. Matthew's history with tragedy wasn't over. Very unfortunately, his father passed away. This only enhanced the darkness that was surrounding Matthew, and he could feel his old depression getting hold of him again, along with something much more sinister. His life at home continued to get worse until the point when it was almost unbearable. The irregular knocks on the walls had evolved into something wild and dangerous. It was officially reaching the level of hostile poltergeist activity. Matthew's days and nights were plagued with unexplainable phenomena. He was always surprised by the knocking on the walls, always 3 firm knocks, and he was nearly convinced that it was some attempt at communication. Not that he wanted to figure out what horrifying message was being delivered to him. All over the house, things would fall randomly and without explanation. In the mornings, things that he had left someplace the previous night appeared somewhere entirely different. Everything got worse and worse until he started seeing him. At first, it only happened in his dreams. In the first dream, Matthew saw a tall silhouette of a man wearing a hat. It got closer and closer until it was able to violently beat up Matthew. Even then, Matthew never got to see his face, only his pitch-black silhouette. This happened again and again, as if the traumatizing nightmares were emotionally grueling enough. In the mornings when Matthew woke up, he would find his body covered in bruises and even small cuts that he most definitely didn't have the previous night. His nightmares were bleeding into the real world, but he hadn't imagined how bad it could be. Matthew's situation finally reached a breaking point. He couldn't take it anymore. He would have ended up crazy. He was holding on to his hope and his faith with all his strength, but the darkness was winning. And, finally, darkness itself knocked on his door. One night, Matthew was getting ready for bed when someone knocked on the closed door of his bedroom. He hesitated, obviously. He lived alone, and he had trained himself to ignore the suspicious knocks he heard everywhere. But this time it was different. This time he moved quietly to the door of his bedroom and opened it slowly. On the other side of the door, there was a man, or at least his silhouette, his shadow. It was a creature darker than the night, an unnatural and infinite black color, with no features, no depth. Nothing human except for his vague silhouette. And he was ready to kill. This shadow creature attacked Matthew. It fought like a man, and it looked like a demon. It punched, kicked, broke, scratched and cut Matthew's body, until it left him barely alive in a puddle of his own blood on the floor. That could have been the ending. After fighting for so long, after all the ups and downs and thinking he had finally saved himself, it looked like Matthew was finally going to lose the fight and be dragged down to hell for once and for all. Just then, Matthew realized that he and his attacker weren't completely alone in that room. He was barely conscious, but he was completely convinced of another presence in the room with them. He focused as hard as he could. He used every little bit of strength he had left. And when he was absolutely sure that this other presence was his own father, Matthew clung to him desperately. It was undeniable. It was his father's spirit. His father's soul was there with him, there to protect him, to stand by him, and to push the evil forces away from Matthew forever. It wasn't easy, and it was difficult to accept that it was over, especially while having to recover from that incident of extreme physical torture. But Matthew wasn't alone anymore. Since that fateful night, instead of all that darkness, Matthew could feel his father's bright and kind spirit with him, protecting him everywhere he went. He never saw the shadow creature or any of its ominous signs ever again. This story was written by Dani Rachel Nieto and narrated by me, James Deverell. Remember, you can get access to the recording of the original interview I conducted with Matthew Keane, the subject of this story, by becoming a patron on my Patreon account. A link is included in the video description. Don't forget to check out the content I am releasing on other platforms such as Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. If you or anyone else you know has a story about anything related to high strangeness, please reach out to me with a brief description to stories@daredeverell.com. I don't need you to write the whole story, so you don't need to worry about being an English major. We'll be doing all the writing. You'll just need to be willing to jump on a call with me so we can have a chat and I can get the whole story. Thanks again for watching.